The ills of the world can get you down. Yes, indeed, they can. You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming at you now from downtown Spokane, it's Gary Krug and Long Waves. And welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me this rainy and cold afternoon. It looks like we may be getting a little bit of winter finally. We can only hope. Well, I've been looking around at news and views this week, as I'm wont to do. And, sometimes when I'm looking at all of the issues and complexities and wrongs in the world, it feels a bit like playing whack-a-mole. There are all of these interlocking interests and powers and players and plots that construct our poverty, our social failures, our failed health care, our foreign policy. And you look around and try to figure out who the players are and who's doing what. You know, the banks, the armies, the spooks, all of these institutions with all of these interlocking abstractions that never seem to pay off the way they say they will, and certainly never deliver on the promises they say they will deliver. And it says a great deal about the public sphere of the United States. And it suggests that maybe what we talk about and what we're told and what we vote on and all of those things that we discuss really have very little to do with reality, and certainly very little to do with creating a better world. So I want to open with a story about how things might be done differently, and how, in fact, some things are being done differently in China. This is from a piece by Pepe Escobar, the Asia Times. November 18, 2014. It's a day that should live in history. On that day, in the city of Yiwu, in China's Xinjiang province, 300 miles south of Shanghai, the first train, carrying 82 containers of export goods weighing more than 1,000 tons, left a massive warehouse complex headed for Madrid. It arrived on December 9th. So this is the new, as Escobar puts it, Trans-Eurasia choo-choo train, 13,000 kilometers. Longest freight train route in the world, 40% longer, he points out, than the legendary Trans-Siberian Railway. Its cargo goes from China, crosses China from east to west, then goes to Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Germany, France, and Spain. Now, the interesting bit about this is how quickly President Xi pulled this together. This new Silk Road economic belt, as it's sometimes called. He launched this thing in September 2013. And 1 month later in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, he announced this maritime Silk Road. So they have this concept that they refer to as one road and one belt, but it's really about this complex infrastructure project of roads and rail lines and sea lanes and belts and all of this. So here we have a Chinese government which has a national strategy to draw on this ancient Silk Road, the road that carried the riches of China's silks and spices to the Middle East and eventually to Europe. And they've greenlighted some $40 billion of infrastructure to build roads, high-speed rail lines, energy pipelines in all of the assorted provinces of China. And eventually this project will expand out to South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, parts of Europe. But Central Asia is where they're going immediately. Central Asia. So think Kazakhstan, where the Chinese have already closed $30 billion in contracts, and Uzbekistan, $15 billion in contracts, and in Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. So here's China with this enormous infrastructure project, really linking the whole of the world island together through a rail system. And Escobar notes that at the same moment that China is proposing a new Eurasian integration, Washington has opted for an empire of chaos. A dysfunctional global system now breeding mayhem and blowback across the greater Middle East into Africa and even to the peripheries of Europe. In this context, Escobar continues, a new Cold War paranoia is on the rise in the U.S., Europe, and Russia. Former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who knows a thing or two about Cold Wars, having ended one, couldn't be more alarmed. Washington's agenda of isolating and arguably crippling Russia is ultimately dangerous, even if, in the long run, it may also be doomed to failure. Now, a little later in the show, I'm going to return to this empire of chaos, which seems to be the U.S. strategy rather globally. But before we get to that, I want to call attention to another set of issues that again, suggest to anybody who's paying attention that whatever we're told about the system, the banking system, the military system, U.S. foreign policy, it's rigged and we're being lied to. So, we recently had the must-pass omnibus, cronibus bill that had to pass Congress and get signed to fund the government. And in the midst of all this, we have Jamie Dimon of Citibank calling representatives, urging them to vote. Jamie Dimon. Now, yeah, in a sense, this is kind of reminiscent of that time that Boehner was handing out envelopes with checks in them from lobbyists to people on the floor before a vote. And really, the only person who in the whole of government who made any splash that got any news coverage was Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, Carrie Elevede, writing for the Daily Cause, had her own observations on this. She said, quote, Senator Elizabeth Warren doesn't like the Dodd-Frank law that was enacted to protect customers from Wall Street any more than the big banks themselves do. I agree with you, she said, addressing Citigroup by name from the Senate floor Friday night. Dodd-Frank isn't perfect. It should have broken Citibank into pieces. Many progressives thought the banking bill, which passed in 2010 in response to the financial meltdown of 2008, was more like window dressing crusading as reform. Warren was one of them. And one of the things that Warren observed in her rather lengthy address to Congress was how many people from Citigroup now hold important positions in government. So we have whole financial agencies in the U.S. government that are essentially run by graduates of Citigroup. And she mentioned a few of these. There was the U.S. Trade representative, and the person nominated to be his deputy, who is presently an assistant secretary at Treasury, a recent chairman of the National Economic Council at the White House, a recent chairman of the Office of Manage and Budget, which oversees the budget for the president, went to Citigroup immediately after leaving the White House, and another chairman of the Office of Manage management and budget is a Citigroup alum. Warren says, but I'm double counting here because he's now Secretary of the Treasury. Warren noted that if we added up all the money that came from the bailout that was given to the banks, the too big to fail banks, right, added all of it up, Citibank received nearly $500 billion. $500 billion with a T, in bailouts. And that's $140 billion more than the next biggest bank got. Well, you know, $140 billion here, $140 billion there. Sooner or later, you're talking about real money, you know. She said, she continued in her talk, Democrats don't like Wall Street bailouts. Republicans don't like Wall Street bailouts. The American people are disgusted with Wall Street bailouts. But in passing a bill that did nothing for American citizens, she said, you raise the risk that taxpayers will have to bail out the biggest banks once again. Right? So what she'd really like to see is the big banks broken up, the too big to fail banks. And that was one of the classic reasons behind the anti-monopoly laws. We can look at major organizations that were busted up as monopolies. Standard Oil comes immediately to mind. Bell Telephone was busted up, creating the baby bells. But the point is that Citibank is one of those entities which wields a great deal of power that we don't vote for, we have no control over, we have no sway over the enormous power that Citibank has. So, sure, the current Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, Citibank, right? There was an amendment to Dodd-Frank called the Brown-Kaufman Law in 2010 that would have broken up the country's 6 largest banks, one of them being Citibank. And it was blocked, and it was blocked mainly by the Treasury Department, by the former employee of the bank that would have been broken up. I mean, talk about putting the fox in the hen house. I mean, this is just crazy. So now we've had this recent vote in the Cronibus bill where there was one element of Dodd-Frank was removed. One element that would have guaranteed that the banks could use federally insured deposit money to gamble with, and that the U.S. government, meaning you and me, would end up having to pay it back. So the banks risk on our back, but profit on their own. So if they win, they take the money. If they lose, we're left holding the card. I don't think I'd go to a casino with those kind of rules. I don't know about you. Where I give somebody else my money and they gamble with it, and if they win, they keep it, and if they lose, then I'm on the hook for paying for their losses. But that's the system. That is the system. And I love this quote from Warren. She said, the provision is all about goosing the profits of the big banks. Quote, people are frustrated with Congress. If big companies can deploy their armies of lawyers and lobbyists to get Congress to vote for special deals that will benefit themselves, then we will simply confirm the view of the American people that the system is rigged, end quote. Well, golly gosh, the system is rigged. And it's not just rigged, but there are a whole host of propaganda machines that create a belief for folks that black is white, up is down, wet is dry. And then our politicians, often at the behest of other large corporate funders, such as the military-industrial complex or big banks, go out and do all kinds of crazy things that, again, you and I, ordinary people, are finally on the hook for. So, for example, back in the first week, at the end of the first week of December, Congress, the House, passed a resolution called 4110. Ron Paul, you remember Ron Paul, actually said about it that it was so full of war propaganda that it rivals the rhetoric from the chilliest era of the Cold War. Pat Buchanan, not one of my favorite people, but sometimes he gets things right. Pat Buchanan referred to it as a Russophobic rant full of falsehoods and steeped in superpower hypocrisy. Some of the particulars that the House talked about were the invasion of Russia into Georgia in 2008. And Buchanan writes, bull hockey. On August 7th through 8th, 2008, Georgia invaded South Ossetia, a tiny province that had won its independence in the 1990s. Georgian artillery killed Russian peacekeepers, and the Georgian army poured in. Only then did the Russian army enter South Ossetia and chase the Georgians back into their own country. The aggressor of the Russo-Georgia War was not Vladimir Putin, but President Mikhail Saakashvili, brought to power in one of those color-coded revolutions we engineered in the Bush II decade. So it goes on and on and on of all of the evils of Russia. And as I've pointed out on this show, and you've probably noticed on your own, the head of NATO says Russia is invading Ukraine. The Guardian newspaper had reporters saying Russian troops and equipment moving into Ukraine. Never a picture, never a video. I mean, Lord knows we got all this high-tech spy gear flying overhead and satellites and spooks on the ground, reporters, and nobody had it together to take a picture of these massive invasions of Russians going into Ukraine. It would be a simple matter. And as Buchanan points out, this is rank Russophobia masquerading as a democratic principle. Right? We seem to support, he says, every ethnic group that secedes from Russia, but no ethnic group that secedes from a successor state. Right? So, what do the people of Crimea, Transnistria, Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Luhansk, or Donetsk want? Do we really know? Do we care? Well, most Americans couldn't find those things on the map, but most Americans couldn't find Texas on the map if they had to. That may be a little unkind. They could probably find Texas, but certainly nothing overseas. Nothing overseas at all. We've made all these noises about how Russia has invaded Ukraine, but the only real incident that anyone can point to is that Russia retrieved, if you will, the Crimea. All right, here's the bit about the Crimea. Crimea had been part of Russia since Catherine the Great. It was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev. Some reports say he was drunk at the time. That he gave the Ukraine Crimea, but this is when it was all part of the Soviet Union, so it was all part of one state. Right? Only when Ukraine fell victim to a coup that removed the democratically elected, corrupt, albeit the democratically elected Yanukovych, in one of those color revolutions, which we'll get to in a minute. It was only then that Russia took steps to secure their hold on the naval base that they have there in Crimea. But, oh dear, we've charged them with all kinds of horrible things. We've charged the Russians with trade barriers, interfering in Ukraine's internal affairs. This is just crazy, and we have agencies that we've sent into Ukraine, like the National Endowment for Democracy and all of its various tentacles, subsidiaries, all of these NGOs, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I mean, these things exist. As Buchanan rightly points out, they exist to interfere in the internal affairs of countries whose regimes we dislike. All right? So when we had our State Department spokesperson, Victoria Nuland, and Senator John McCain, as Buchanan puts it, prancing around Kiev, urging insurgents to overthrow the democratically elected government of Yanukovych. We had Nuland caught boasting about how the U.S. had invested $5 billion in the political reorientation of Ukraine, and actually specifying who the U.S. thought should be in the government. All right. So the idea that, and I'm going to say a lot more about the interventions in Ukraine, and especially about the National Endowment for Democracy in just a minute, because this is a slippery bunch, and they have their fingers in a lot of pies. So, moving along, the House Resolution 578 charges Russia with backing Syria's Assad and providing it with weapons to use against the Syria people. Well, if you think, let's back up a minute. Assad's principal enemies, Buchanan's right, points out, are the al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS. They are not only his enemies and Russia's enemies, but our enemies. And we ourselves have become de facto allies of Assad with our airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. And what is Russia doing for its ally in Damascus, Buchanan continues, by arming it to resist ISIS secessionists? That we are not doing for our ally in Baghdad, also under attack by the Islamic State. So he's calling us out. Right? We're arming our buddies in Baghdad, and Russia's arming its buddies in Syria. They're all fighting the same enemy, ISIS and al-Nusra. All right? So this is just Looney Tunes, and Buchanan's quite right. Quoting Buchanan again, damning Russian aggression, the House demands that Russia get out of Crimea, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, calls on Obama to end all military cooperation with Russia, impose visa bans, targeted asset freezes, sectoral sanctions, and send lethal articles to Ukraine. And Buchanan quite rightly points out that is the sort of ultimatum that led to Pearl Harbor. Why, he asks, would a moral nation arm Ukraine to fight a longer and larger war with Russia that Kiev could not win, but that could end up costing the lives of tens of thousands more Ukrainians? Those who produced this provocative resolution do not belong in charge of U.S. foreign policy, nor of America's nuclear arsenal. You know, and I would call Congress a whorehouse. I really would, except I think it would be a disservice to the long distinguished history of bordellos. So let's just talk about another little piece that was passed, and that was H.R. 10305. You probably missed this one. Oh, this was a great piece. And the really amazing thing is how they passed it. Right, so it was passed unanimously, and the newspapers are all full of passed the House unanimously. There were three representatives on the floor. Right, the Speaker moved for unanimous consent to discharge the bill from committees. Now, the thing about unanimous consent, it's this neat little parliamentary trick where under unanimous consent, if no one objects, you can just go ahead and pretty much do whatever you want to do. Pass bills, anything you want. Well, a couple of the members stood up and made a few comments, but of course it passed. And if you listen to the comments, and these are taken directly from the Congressional Record, which you can find on Thomas, Congressional Record. All right, first of all, we had Mr. Engel, who was one of those people there. Ms. Wagner was the Speaker pro tem. And Mr. Engel says, it is clear that Russia is not only fomenting separatism in Ukraine, it is actively supporting the uprising and sending troops to back it up. This is an invasion, pure and simple. So, if we look at the statements of Ms. Koptur, it is clear that Russia is actively fomenting upheaval and propaganding in the West about its illegal invasion. It's an invasion, plain and simple. Well, golly gosh. They go on to say, all kinds of silliness. We must not bow to Putin's aggression, blah, blah, blah. But here's an interesting bit. Again, back to Mr. Engel. Since the Cold War, a vision has emerged of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. That reality is within reach. Putin's aggression puts that future in dire jeopardy. We cannot let that hope die. Okay, Ms. Kaptur's version. Since the Cold War, a vision has emerged of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And that reality is within reach. Putin's reckless aggression cannot stand. The United States cannot let the hope of liberty die, surely. These are almost word-for-word statements. Somebody gave them index cards or tweets or however it's done on the floor, and they went down and made the statements that someone wanted them to make and didn't even bother to tweak the language over much to make it appear like they were actually acting independently. They went down, they sang the party song, and they passed House Resolution 10305. Now this is a monster of a bill, and Russia is rightly upset about it. So, okay, here we have this bill. 3 out of 425 members are present. All right. It was passed. Boom. The House adjourned. Everybody went home. But the bill they passed has some really sweeping policy restrictions, policy sanctions against Russia. One, it sanctions the Russian energy industry. It sanctions the Russian defense industry with respect to arms sales to Syria. It has broad sanctions on Russian banking and investment. Here's an interesting one. It also included provisions for privatizing Ukrainian infrastructure, electricity, oil, gas, renewables. And, you know, we should perhaps remember at this point that one of Joe Biden's sons is over in the Ukraine with one of those gas companies, which just was encouraged to buy chunks of Ukraine. And we'll see a lot of Ukraine sold off in the near future. More about that in a minute. We're going to give $50 million to assist a corporate takeover of Ukraine's oil and gas sectors. $50 million to help the corporations, those poor, struggling oil companies who really need some help, to take over Ukraine's oil and gas. We're at $350 million for military assistance. So we're talking anti-tank guns, anti-armor guns, optical equipment, guidance control equipment, drones. What could go wrong? $30 million for an intensive, and they actually spelled this out, $30 million for an intensive radio, TV, and internet propaganda campaign throughout the countries of the former Soviet Union. And $20 million for, quote, democratic organizing. $20 million for democratic organizing in Ukraine. And most of this would be spent through the National Endowment for Democracy. Remember them from a minute ago? We're going to get to them. $60 million will be spent to improve democratic governance, transparency, and accountability. Dennis Kucinich, former representative, had a lovely comment about that. He said, what brilliant hyperbole to pass a provision, such a provision, in the same week, the Senate's CIA torture report was released. Well, yeah, duh. There was an unverified declaration that Russia had violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and so was a nuclear threat to the United States. This opens, of course, the door, which is mentioned in the resolution, for the U.S. to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I would love to hear what Europe thinks of this. So is the U.S. going to start forward-basing cruise and ballistic missiles, nuclear drones to counteract the Russian threat? I'll bet Germany and France and Austria and Poland would just not be terribly pleased with this. But anyway, it also allows Ukraine to abrogate the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it signed, and it opens the door to putting nuclear missiles 300 miles from Moscow. You can imagine how the Russians feel about that. Remember how the U.S. freaked out when Cuba had missiles from the Russians? Oh my God, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, people justifiably get a little concerned. And, there was a demand that Russia dismantle any ground-launched cruise missiles or ballistic missiles with a range between 300 and 3,300 miles. Oh, my goodness. Okay, well, that's what the U.S. Congress did. Meanwhile, on the same day in Ukraine, and this has got to be certainly not a coincidence, and for those of you looking for the U.S. hand in global affairs, here you go. On the very same day, the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev approved a security plan that declares that Ukraine should become a military state, that reallocates more of its budget for military purposes. In fact, it specifies that they would increase military spending in Ukraine from 1% to 5% of the gross domestic product over the next couple of years. Wow. This in a country that is about to fall over, that is absolutely on the verge of a complete economic collapse. Germany had to beg Russia not to prematurely call in money that Ukraine owes them to the tune of some $3 billion. But they're going to increase their military spending because, golly gosh, that's what you do. The bill in the Ukrainian parliament also put military operating units on alert. It mobilized National Guard units and reserve units, and it specified that Ukraine should join NATO and switch to NATO military standards. So I guess all that nasty Russian gear just wouldn't be much use to them anymore, all those MiG-29s and Hind helicopters and Anatovs. Oh, well, anyway. So Kucinich writes about this. Under the guise of democratizing, the West stripped Ukraine of its sovereignty with a U.S.-backed coup, employed it as a foil to advance NATO to the Russian border, and reignited the Cold War, complete with another nuclear showdown. The people of Ukraine will be less free as their country becomes a military state, goes into hock to international banks, faces structural readjustments, privatization of its public assets, decline of social services, higher prices, and even more severe decline in its standard of living. Now think about this for a minute. This is pretty much what happens when a country that's not terribly strong, maybe is having some economic issues, bows to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. banksters, who come in and say, great, we'll loan you money. We'll give you development money. You can build your bridges, your schools, your houses. You build up your military, which is apparently what the Ukrainians are going to use a big chunk of it for. And all you have to do is privatize everything and make it available to foreign corporations. Oh, yeah, and we're also going to require that you enact austerity measures. So you're going to dissolve your pensions, you're going to cut back your health care, cut back your schools, because you can't afford all that, heavens. Cut back your financial assistance to the poor. You certainly can't afford that. My gosh, this is just madness. And so what you end up with are broken poor states, in hoc to their teeth, with the citizens completely screwed. Completely. Right? In its dealings with the EU and with the U.S., they couldn't even get concessions to let their people, Ukraine couldn't get concessions to let their people go work in Europe, right? They're not part of the EU. It is unlikely Ukraine will ever become part of the EU. The EU needs another albatross around its neck, like Spain and France. Not at all. So it's extremely unlikely that the EU is going to let them come in and just let their people go work wherever, and send the money back to Ukraine, because that's what freedom would be about. But we really don't care about Ukraine. Europe doesn't care about Ukraine. The United States government doesn't care about Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, Biden's son, none of these people care about Ukraine, except as they can use it in this geopolitical chess game. The great game, as I've called it on the show before, as it's been known for centuries. So Ukraine is on its way to becoming a military state, joining, as Kucinich calls it, the NATO gun club. And they still wouldn't be anything like a match for Russia. Right? So it's interesting that this bill was passed without debate, was passed without discussion on the floor of the House by chicanery, by a parliamentary fiat, a bill that arguably endangers the U.S., endangers Ukraine, puts the world a little bit closer to a real war footing, not just a Cold War footing. This is so dangerous. Kucinich has a lovely phrase. He says, it portends that our nation is sleepwalking through the graveyards of history toward an abyss where controlling factors reside in the realm of chance. Sleepwalking through the graveyards of history. Well, it sure seems that way. Yeah, because if you put intermediate range weapons, for example, right on somebody's border within a couple of 100 miles, and these are those little intermediate ballistic missiles, which you can shoot in all kinds of fun ways, depressed trajectories, all kinds of cute things you can do. You can get the flight times down to being virtually so short that no response is possible. So you see the missiles coming, and maybe you've got 30 seconds. Well, in that situation, there's no opportunity to verify what's happening, to get evidence that this is in fact going on and not a malfunction or a glitch or something else. And all sides end up being on a hair trigger with their guns pointed at one another. This is the danger of intermediate range missiles, which were supposed to be used for, backing up conventional warfare. But they have this shortness of flight that makes them extremely dangerous. Hence, we have a treaty in the first place. We have another treaty, which the Russians didn't abrogate, the Russians didn't break, the U.S. did, and that was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that's another one of those treaties that is actually stabilizing, because it says nobody builds missiles to shoot down ballistic missiles. You don't do it. You have to maintain the balance of terror, mutually assured destruction. Well, what is the U.S. doing now except building a ring of anti-ballistic missiles around Russia and virtually on their borders, so that Russian missiles would be picked off if they were ever launched, and the U.S. missiles would succeed. The danger of this, again, is it puts one in the position of use it or lose it. If you even suspect trouble, the only sensible course of action is for you to fire your missiles first, before your missiles are degraded by incoming attacks and the ABM systems can simply pick off what remains. You have only one option. So the situation that we're creating in Ukraine and the kind of bellicose rhetoric that we continue to spew forth makes the world much, much more dangerous than ever before. So we are well and truly back to the bad old days of the Cold War. And President Obama, well, Obama said he will sign that sanctions bill, according to the AFP, the Agence France Presse. He said he would do it. His spokesman, Josh Earnest, love that name, a spokesman named Ernest. The president does indeed to sign the bill. It does preserve the president's flexibility, though, to carry out this strategy. Well, golly gosh, golly gosh. So, another problem here is that, that Ernest himself noted that passing these new sanctions, none of this has been coordinated or approved or even discussed with our European allies, our stalwart friends like Germany and France and the UK. And there is a concern of sending a confusing message to our allies. No, the message is really, really, really clear. But the sanctions contain language that don't reflect discussions that are going on. This is what Ernest says. It includes some sanctions language that does not reflect the consultations that are ongoing. As I say, Germany, France, England, Poland, Belgium, Holland, a lot of places cannot at all be thrilled about the U.S. rattling sabers on their borders. And the Russians are certainly not thrilled. Their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said, and I quote, "This move by the United States is, of course, hostile." Well, duh. Yeah, it's hostile. I'm glad somebody's actually saying it out loud. Now, I said a moment ago, I was talking about those non-governmental agencies who are going to take all the blessings of democracy into places like Ukraine, and how we've allocated money to make sure they go in there and bring the blessings of the neocon and neoliberal and corporate democracy to the world. So let's talk about the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. NED was formed back in the 1980s. What happened was the CIA got caught running propaganda programs, secretly undermining other governments in their countries. And they'd slip in agents, and they'd pay people, they'd hire reporters, they'd engineer coups, and they got stopped from doing that. So Americans, being nothing if not resourceful, simply formed it's laughably called an NGO, but it's wholly funded by the U.S. government. And if you look at the membership, it's a who's who of hawks and neocons and neoliberals. It's a revolving doorway. I mean, seriously. So if you look at some of the people who have served on the board of directors, We have former secretaries of state, including Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright. We have former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci, former National Security Council Chair Zbigniew Brzezinski, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Wesley Clark. We have head of the World Bank, Paul Wolfowitz, who was also in Bush's cabinet. We have Bill Brock, who was a U.S. Senator and a trade representative and U.S. Secretary of Labor, and then he was chairman of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. And you remember that $5 billion. $5 billion that Victoria Nuland revealed that had been invested in Ukrainian democracy before the coup, which, again, removed a democratically elected leader, Yanukovych, and replaced him with a non-elected leader. That $5 billion, what exactly was that buying? What was so important in Ukraine that the U.S. government spent $5 billion engineering a coup which will not lead to greater democracy, will not lead to peace and happiness? It won't. Ukraine's not the only place where Ned has been busy. If you look at all those color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, Ned was all about that. Ned was in there engineering those and picking leaders and funding them and training them and bringing in people to train them and setting up organizations that would bring pressure and then put the people that the U.S. had handpicked into power, precisely as happened in the Ukraine. It sounds like American democracy. Actually, it does, don't you think? The powers that be hand select some folks. We pretend to have elections, and they pretend to actually listen, pretend to actually represent us, but of course they don't. So some of the other places that NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has been busy, well, if you look at some of the revolts around the world, NED's pretty much there. You could think about Egypt, yes. Iraq, yes. Afghanistan, you betcha. Lebanon, and numerous South and Central American countries, Venezuela and Mexico, to name but a few. And what do you get when NED goes in? What is their branch, their version of democracy? Well, it's very top-down. It's basically an autocracy of oligarchs. It's ruled by the wealthy. You install your people, which is exactly what happened in Ukraine. We took out one corrupt oligarch, but at least he had the virtue of being elected, and we installed another corrupt oligarch and a bunch of Nazis. And I don't use the term Nazi loosely. Now, cast back in your memory, you may have seen some pictures of John McCain in Ukraine. And he's meeting with people, having his picture taken. Very happy to have his arms around them, supporting. Well, John McCain, Senator John McCain of Arizona, is the head of a branch of the National Endowment for Democracy. It's called the International Republican Institute. So why was John McCain in Ukraine meeting with Nazis before the coup? Well, he was helping to set up Ned's version of democracy, pro-military, a U.S. client state, privatizing everything for Western companies, allowing its wealth to be siphoned off by economic hitmen through loans and austerity measures. Golly gosh. So Ned, another one of those strange little forces. It just pops up, goes in, does its work, and what we see is just the TV coverage. And the TV coverage, oh gee, Just turn your TV off. Don't even watch. You will still know what's going on, and you will not have your head full of lies and nonsense. But these behind-the-scenes moves where Newland is conversing with Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and saying exactly who we want in office, and not that guy, but this guy, and let's give the Nazis a couple of positions because they will be useful. And these are Nazis. Look at the history of Ukraine, especially look at Western Ukraine. It's not that Nazis conquered Ukraine and Ukrainians were forced to rise up and some bad ones turned to join the Nazis. A lot of Western Ukrainians volunteered, actively fought the Nazis. You look at the pictures coming out of Ukraine. You see people with SS symbols on their helmet. You see people with swastikas. You see photographs and see reports of prisoners they capture who get branded with swastikas on their buttocks. These are real Nazis. For those of you who weren't following the coup very well, you should go back and do a little history. Go back and look at the news from sites in the region. Forget the U.S. news. It's not worth the time it takes, generally. But go back and look at the news that was coming out of it. Look at the pictures. Go back and look at the discussions around the Nazis, who was involved. Look at the murder of opposition opponents, of opposition members. Look at journalists being bullied, politicians being beaten up. I mean, this is B-flat kind of classic brown shirt stuff, don't you think? But, you know, that's the blessings of democracy, American style. Don't believe it. So I want to return just here at the end of the show to Pepe Escobar's idea of the Ark of Chaos. Who exactly, what exactly is the force behind the chaos in the Middle East? ISIS? ISIS is our creation. They were born in Abu Ghraib prison. Their training grew out of the training we gave the Mujahideen. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, 3 of those places, smoking heaps, all beneficiaries of spreading that zone of democracy, as Ledeen once said, one of the neocon theorists, going to expand the zone of freedom. I don't think the Iraqis feel free. I don't think the Syrians feel free. I don't think the Libyans feel free. I think we've been remarkably unsuccessful in spreading these democratic processes, so-called. So returning to Pepe Escobar, he notes the European Council on Foreign Relations and a Berlin think tank called the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung have come to about the same conclusion. Quote, if the dangerous standoff between the EU and Russia over Ukraine is not solved, the EU could face up to 2030, a military buildup in Eastern Europe, a new arms race with NATO as a protagonist, and a semi-permanent zone of instability from the Baltic to the Balkans and the Black Sea. From the Baltic to the Balkans and the Black Sea. What they will never acknowledge, is that this new European arc of instability is exactly what the U.S. and its proxy army, NATO, are working to bring about. An arc of instability. Look at the Middle East. It's an arc of instability. You remember Rumsfeld telling us how, I think the war will be over in 3 months. I don't think 6. Remember Afghanistan? And now Ukraine, now Russia, and we're going to fall for this nonsense again? Going to fall for this nonsense again? Oh, I hope not. Escobar continues, the Pentagon excels in fabricating arcs of instability. The previous one was and remains massive, stretching from the Maghreb to Xinjiang in western China, across the Middle East and Central Asia. Wow, that's a big chunk of the world. An arc of instability. Our making. Your tax dollars at work. If you're wondering why your tuition's going up at schools, why food's more expensive, why you don't actually have anything like meaningful health care in this country, look at where the money's being spent. Look at where it's being spent. Escobar continues, what's certain is that the Empire of Chaos won't relent in its strategy of heating up the new arc of instability inside Europe, across the economic financial spectrum, and instrumentalizing its prefabricated new Iron Curtain from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Kremlin seems to know exactly how high the stakes are. As the Saker told me in an email, Saker's a blogger. His blog is Saker of the Vineyard, one of the smart people who is a must-read if you're reading Russian politics. As the Saker told me in an email, Putin is telling both the West and the Russian people that there is a long war in progress and that the Russian people have to be morally prepared to accept sacrifices for the survival of Russia. He also reminded the Russian people, just as an aside here, he also reminded the Russian people of what has happened historically to people who invade from the West. Hitler and Napoleon and so on. Back to Escobar now. This is one more step in the coming out of what I call the Eurasian sovereigntists, in which the U.S. has now openly declared as Russophobic, Russia-hating, Russia-fearing enemy, and the Europeans as a powerless colony. Military power is not directly a factor in this. The internal power balance between the pro-Western Atlantic integrationists and the Eurasian sovereigntists is. So here we are, a U.S. population largely supporting this nonsense, spoon-fed propaganda by their own government, whack-a-mole, chaos, lies, deceit, murder, war. It all seems about right. Situation normal. You know, we watch TV and try to presume, but don't have a clue. The news, the propaganda, it's just a drug to keep us confused, servile, while the folks in power do what they do. And that brings me to the end of another show. You've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug, and we are broadcast on KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You can email us, me, at longwaves@kyrs.org. Follow me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, and currently the podcasts are also linked out of the Facebook page. They're on YouTube, Long Waves Radio again. I hope you'll join me next week, which, if I'm not terribly mistaken, is Christmas Eve. And until then, have a good day.